I grew up in a shotgun house down in Louisiana. They're shaped like rectangles with doors at the short ends, and they're called shotgun houses because you can fire a shotgun through the front door and the pellets would fly out the back door. They were small homes built for low-income families, and my mom worked hard to be able to purchase it through a rent-to-buy scheme. But working so hard meant that I grew up a latchkey kid. Sometimes I'd have to get myself to school in the morning because she was working crazy hours, and most of the time when I got home afterwards, there'd be a Hungry Man frozen dinner in the freezer for me to eat and a note saying that she'd be back at whatever time. I didn't see her nearly as much as I wanted to, and I'm thankful for all the work that she put into keeping us afloat. But her being out of the house so much opened the door for one of the creepiest experiences of my whole life. It all started when I got home from school one afternoon. I walked through the door, got my food, and then sat in front of the TV while I ate. I'm just sitting there, finishing off my Hungry Man, when I see something moving in the corner of my eye, right near the front window. Immediately, I turn my head to see what it is, and I notice a white man just standing there, looking through the window at me. For a few moments after we made eye contact, he just continued to stare at me. Then his lips started to curl into this creepy-looking smile. I remember how his face looked all those years later, how the lower half seemed to be smiling, but his eyes were cold. I was so nervous that all I could think to do was look away. I was a shy kid, and I still deal with a degree of social anxiety in my adult life, but back then I barely engaged with anyone, let alone complete strangers. I just waited there, watching TV and trying to ignore the guy until finally his face disappeared from view. I waited a few more minutes, too scared to close the curtains in case his face suddenly appeared again, until eventually I plucked up the courage to walk over and close them. I think I've been sitting down again for maybe 5 or 10 minutes, thinking I was rid of the guy when I heard someone pressing the buzzer to our house. My mom always told me never to answer the door to anyone I didn't know, and that anyone I did would always announce themselves when they called over so I'd know it was safe. So, when I heard the buzzer but no one hollered, I just stayed there on the couch and carried on watching TV. The buzzer sounded a few more times, but I still didn't move, and I remember praying that it wasn't the guy with the creepy smile at the door. But when I heard the voice that called out to me, I just knew that it was him. Somehow, the voice matched the face, and my skin crawled as the sound of it reached my ears. "Little girl, I know you're in there." I just locked up, barely breathing as he continued to push the buzzer. "Little girl, I'm a friend of your mommy. Now come and open the door, 'cause we need to have a little talk." I stayed still like a statue on that couch. I'd never seen that man before in my life, and to my knowledge, I knew most of my mom's friends, at least by their faces. I think if anyone else had said that, maybe even dropped my mom's name, I'd have opened the door to hear them out, but the guy's smile, the tone of his voice, even at such a young age, I knew that he didn't have good intentions. I was terrified, but I just kept quiet, didn't respond, and eventually the buzzing stopped. Again, it took me a little while to settle down again, but when I did, I picked up my Hungry Man tray and walked into the kitchen to throw it in the trash. As I walked in, something once again moved in the corner of my eye, and this time, I just about jumped back and dropped my tray when I saw it. I ran over to the window and peered out into our small backyard. I didn't see anything, but that doesn't mean I didn't know something was there, and I strongly suspected it was the guy who had been trying to get me to open the door. Then, right as I was looking outside, I heard a low rattling, then squeaking sound coming from the hallway. I backed up to try and spy where it was coming from, and it was definitely coming from the back door. I just couldn't figure out where until one of the screws holding the door handle together fell out of its socket. I noticed as it fell and hit the wooden paneling, and then I watched as one of the other tiny screws started to turn, unwinding from its socket, loosening with every turn. Someone, and I bet I knew who, was trying to break into our home, and it was only a matter of time before they were inside. I just ran for the front door, bursting out into the street and rushing towards a neighbor's place, the same neighbor that Mom had always told me to contact in case of an emergency. I started hammering on their door, praying they were home, and the whole time I was looking over my shoulder expecting the creepy smile guy to appear from behind our house. To this day, I can still remember the rush of absolute terror as he suddenly appeared at the side walkway, that same grim smile curling his lips as he began to walk towards me. I started screaming, smashing my fists against the door of my neighbor's place, begging them to come to the door. I hear a voice on the other side just before it opened. Then there stood my neighbor, a towel wrapped around them, asking me what I was crying for. I begged them to call the cops because a man was trying to get me. When they asked who was trying to get me, I turned, intent on pointing at the man with the creepy smile who, just a few moments ago, had been walking up the side of our house. But when I looked, pointing at the place that I'd spotted him, he was gone. When the cops showed up and my mom had arrived home, they confirmed that someone had been trying to take the lock off of our back door. Mom was distraught and kept apologizing to me for not being there to protect me. After that, I always stayed with one of our neighbors until she got home from work. The guy never showed up again, and I didn't see him around the neighborhood anymore, which was obviously a good thing. But I've always been haunted by the idea that he still thinks about the time he almost got a kid, and how if I hadn't noticed what was happening to the back door, he was maybe just minutes away from being able to do whatever he wanted to me. I'm a single dad to a wonderful daughter who's been the light of my life from the very moment she was born. It would be an understatement to say things weren't easy after her mother passed, but we made it through the grief together, and that had strengthened our family bond. My daughter had since grown and flown the nest, and we've always had a great relationship. But when she was growing up, I found myself gripped by fear that I'd end up losing her too. Sometimes that terror of loneliness was just background noise, something I managed to ignore by busying myself. Other times it was overwhelming, and I'd become so overly cautious and protective of her that sometimes I feel like I failed her as a father. She missed out on a few field trips, a handful of her friends' birthday parties, and a whole lot of play dates, all because I was just too nervous to leave her alone in a place that I wasn't familiar with. It got to the point where, around the time of her 13th birthday, I realized that I'd never left her home alone before. Even when it came to short grocery store runs, I'd insist that she'd hit pause on whatever she was doing to join me on whatever errand I was running. That worked when she was younger, but then the older she got, the more she appeared to resent being attached to my hip. The whole thing culminated in a small argument one day, when she was insistent on me leaving her at home so she could finish off some homework while she was still feeling studious. My words, not hers, by the way. I won the argument, and she had a face like thunder during the ride to the grocery store, but I started to wonder if I should be relaxing my policies as she got older. A few months later, after a long period of reflection, I walked into her room and told her that I was making a quick run to Target to pick up a few things. She groaned, slumped off her chair, and moved to put her shoes on. Then, with theatrical timing, I told her that I would be going alone. She smiled, the kind of smile that brings a lot of joy as a parent. It was a smile that marked a milestone in both of our lives. She was growing up, and it was time to start giving her some space. I know it might sound pretty dumb, but I actually got a little emotional while climbing into the driver's seat and edging out of our driveway. The whole kids growing up so fast thing is for sure overused, but it's overused because it's true. By the time I got to Target, I'd fought back all the tears, and after repeatedly telling myself everything is going to be fine, I actually began to feel a semblance of calm. Then, as I'm walking up and down the aisles, picking up odds and ends, I feel my phone start to vibrate in my pocket. I pull it out and see it's my daughter calling me, probably to ask me to pick something up for her. I press the green button, bring the phone to my ear, and before I can even say anything, all I can hear is screaming and crying. I just left the shopping cart where it was, sprinting out of the store and back towards my car. Then as I was driving back to the apartment, I tried calming her down and getting her to tell me what was happening. She just kept saying, I don't know. I think someone shot a gun." My next question was, "Are you hurt?" And when she replied, "Yes," I just tossed my phone down, got both hands on the wheel, and then started speeding back towards our apartment. Minutes later, I was only 2 blocks from my apartment when I saw flashing lights in the rearview mirror. I felt sick as I realized that I was faced with 2 distinct choices: run from the cops to get to my daughter and risk getting myself shot or something when I jumped out of my car to run inside, or pull over, try my best to explain the situation, and temporarily condemn my daughter to her fate. To some, that might seem like a real conundrum, but to a parent, absolutely zero thought is involved in the decision-making. You help your child, there are no other options. I never thought that I'd ever get into an actual police chase in my life. Aside from a few parking tickets, I've always walked the line and stayed firmly on the right side of the law, so the fact that I was gunning it away from a cop car, praying they'd understand my reasoning, it was surreal in the extreme. I raced the 2 blocks back to my apartment, skidded into my driveway, then got out of the car with my hands in the air as the cops raced in behind me. I remember them jumping out too, taking cover behind their open doors, then pointing guns or tasers at me as I screamed at them, "I'm so sorry. My daughter's in trouble. I couldn't stop. I can't stop." I kept repeating my story as one of the cops approached with his gun drawn, and I don't know if it was the tone of my voice or the look in my eyes, but all of a sudden, he stops and asks me where my keys are. Recognizing that he was giving me the benefit of the doubt, I told him that my front door keys were attached to my car keys and that they were still in the ignition of my car. He told his partner to keep an eye on me. Then he grabs my keys after shutting off my engine, then basically runs into my apartment to look for my daughter. That was a truly terrifying few minutes for me, because I had no idea what the cops were going to find. I didn't know if it was an intruder still in the apartment, or if all they were going to find was my daughter's body, and waiting for the answer with a gun pointed at me felt like an eternity. When the cop emerged moments later, leading my daughter out of the apartment, it was probably the purest, most overwhelming sense of relief I've ever felt. But when I saw that she had blood all over her, I begged the cops to call an ambulance to get her to the hospital. And the one cop who went inside said that he'd wait with her until the EMTs arrived, but the other guy was going to have to arrest me for fleeing a traffic stop. The cop was just doing his job, I know that. There's no way that he could have just let me go for starting a car chase, no matter how small it was, but he gave me dignity of just sitting me in the back seat of the squad car while it was parked across the street. Me getting arrested like that obviously made the situation even more distressing for my daughter, who had no idea why I was being held in the back of that squad car. But after she calmed down a little, one of the cops checked her injuries and came over to tell me that she'd be okay, and that all her injuries were basically superficial. I asked him if it was 100% sure because my daughter had mentioned something about a gunshot when she called me, but the cop was able to assure me that she had no gunshot wounds, just a bunch of glass cuts to her upper arm and lower cheek. Again, I felt this overwhelming sense of relief, and for the second time that day, I found myself fighting back tears. A few minutes later, the EMT showed up. Then after a quick examination of my daughter's injuries, she was driven to the hospital to get stitches. That was my cue to be taken to jail, but I was out on bail in just a few hours later after being given a court summons for fleeing the traffic stop. I immediately drove over to the hospital to pick up my daughter, who by then had a line of stitches along the worst of her wounds, which ran along her jawline. On the way back to our apartment, I got her to tell me exactly what had happened to cause her injuries, as obviously I still didn't understand how a gunshot had caused glass injuries. She said that she was making a sandwich and getting a glass of water and had just placed the glass of water down in front of her on our little breakfast nook when it suddenly exploded. The explosion of glass was what caused the cuts on her arm and face, and right around the same time, she said that she had heard a loud bang coming from the apartment next door. Now, without boring you with too much detail, the layout of our kitchen is such that there's no way someone could have actually aimed a shot at her. But when I got back home and spoke to the cops who were still there, all became clear. They had already arrested our neighbor in the apartment next door, as the angle of the bullet holes in our kitchen showed exactly where the shot had come from. Apparently, the guy was drunk, or at least some other kind of intoxicated, and had decided to clean his guns without checking if they were actually loaded or not. He admitted to the whole thing, and apparently broke down crying in the cop car, thinking he'd seriously hurt someone after hearing all the screaming. He caught a reckless endangerment charge, which he was eventually convicted of, but he didn't see any jail time for it. He only has his guns confiscated after receiving a suspended sentence and mandatory substance counseling, and call me biased, but I think that he should have been handed a whole lot more. Me, on the other hand, I pled no contest to the traffic stop thing, but after the judge learned of the circumstances and how they were related to the other guy's reckless endangerment charge, I only had to pay $500 mandatory fine instead of having my license suspended for a year on top of that. According to my attorney, it was about as good a deal as I was ever going to get, as obviously no one is above the law, and the cops take fleeing traffic stops very, very seriously. In the end, it was clear to both me and my daughter that we had both dodged a major disaster, and it was something that I was very thankful for. But just as I gotten comfortable with giving my daughter some space and privacy in her life, the anxiety of losing her somehow came back 100 times stronger, and it wreaked havoc on my mental health. For the first time in my life, I actively sought out therapy on my sister's recommendations, and I have to admit that weekly sessions put a serious dent in my paranoia and overprotectiveness. I never turned out to be one of those hands-off, carefree parents. I'm still not, even now that she's moved out and living in some fancy apartment downtown. I'll always be her father. Not a thing in the world is going to change that, but this also means that until the day that I'm in the dirt, I'll always be scared. Back in 2012, I sat down with my girlfriend, and after 18 months of dating, I told her my family's deepest, darkest secret. 3 weeks later, I came home from work to find all of her stuff gone and a breakup letter sitting on the kitchen table. I learned not to talk to anyone but my sister about it, but I also feel like if I don't get the stuff off my chest from time to time, it'll just eat me alive from the inside out. I've survived this long by talking to therapists, but at this point, I view therapy like atheists view confessional booths. They're a nice novelty, but they're inconsequential. The internet, on the other hand, is an altogether different beast. Not only can I remain anonymous, but you can too. And just like it allows me to say things I'd never tell a person face to face, it allows you to give me your full and unfettered opinions, as brutal as they may be. But I'm okay with that. And that's why I'm writing this, because I don't want absolution. I want judgment. I was 12 years old at the time of my discovery, and all summer, I had this one all-consuming obsession: Pokemon Red. I put hours and hours into catching and training all original 150 Pokemon. Then when I beat the Elite Four and completed my Pokédex, I just deleted my save and started all over again. But in showing that I loved playing Pokemon so much, I gave my parents a way of punishing me whenever I misbehaved. They were great parents to me for the most part, and my frequent misdeeds were mostly harmless. But whenever I failed to do my chores or was rude to my sister, their go-to confiscation item was my Game Boy. It'd go like this. They'd hide my Game Boy somewhere, but I'd always find it. Then I'd get caught playing it and have it taken away again. This meant that I spent a lot of time snooping around their bedroom and my dad's office, and since it was still summer vacation, I had plenty of time to do it. But it was during my little searching sessions that I discovered that my dad had a secret space hidden away in his office. He normally kept it locked, but then during one afternoon snooping, I found the key. In his office, my dad had this big old antique cabinet that he kept all kinds of junk in, and I knew he sometimes hid my Game Boy in it. So after having no luck elsewhere, I began to search it. I remember sticking my hand into one of the bottom cabinets, leaning in just a little too hard. Then, I heard a dull crunch of wood as the rear wall of the cabinet suddenly gave way. Then when I looked, hoping I hadn't broken it, I saw that there was a small hidden compartment. Due to the dim light, the only thing I recognized at first was the gun, but there was also something that looked like a letter and, more importantly, something shaped like my Game Boy. I reached out to grab it, but as soon as I touch it, I realize it's not my Game Boy. It felt leathery, not the plastic I was used to, and as curiosity got the better of me, I pulled it out of the hidey hole to see what it was. It was a journal, this old-looking leather-bound journal, and when I opened it up, I recognized my dad's handwriting. I might have recognized his handwriting, but I definitely didn't understand most of what was written. The entries were clearly dated, but what followed was an unintelligible mess of abbreviations, words, and phrases. There was also these little hand-drawn diagrams of what looked like beds, along with stickmen that had their limbs contorted into unnatural positions. I didn't 100% understand what I was looking at, but I just knew from the fact that it was hidden that it was some part of some secret side that Dad didn't show us. I was so filled with grim curiosity that I felt compelled to check the other stuff out too. First came the gun. It was much heavier than they looked in the movies, and it was much scarier too. I held it like it was made of glass, not even daring to touch the trigger. I then put it back as slowly and carefully as I could. I saved the thing that looked like an envelope until last. I figured that it'd be sealed, but after retrieving it, I saw that it wasn't an envelope at all. It was one of those plastic wallets that one-hour photograph developers give you, the kind that has all your photos and negatives tucked inside. I figured that it might be pictures of my family, since those are the only kind I've ever seen come out of a wallet like that. But the only member of my family present in the pictures was my dad, and this version of him was unlike any I'd ever known. The first few pictures were of a bed somewhere I didn't recognize. It didn't look all that remarkable at first, but then I noticed the rope tied around the bedposts, and that bad feeling I had started to intensify. The next few pictures were of a bunch of tools, all laid out on a wooden table, but I noticed a few other things mixed in with them. There was a hammer, a hand drill, a pair of metal pliers, all home improvement stuff, but there was also a scalpel and other surgical-looking tools that looked so sharp it made me wince. The next photographs I saw were of my dad, but like I said earlier, there was something really off about him. He'd taken some pictures of himself, but he seemed to be particularly interested in the way his eyes looked, as some were close-up shots of them. I don't know why he didn't just take a look at them in the mirror, but then again, I had no idea why Dad was doing any of this stuff, let alone why he wanted to hide it from us. But when I saw the next picture, I got this intense feeling of dread, and I knew that I was looking at something he'd never want me or Mom to ever see. I figured the first person in the selfie was my dad, but their face was covered by a kind of cloth sack made of black wire mesh, so I couldn't be 100% certain. Assuming that he could see out of it, there was no good reason why my dad would want to cover his face up like that. There was also no good reason why he'd want to use it as a blindfold, and the thought of him doing something like that filled me with dread. But then, when it came to the next few pictures, that feeling was replaced by one of confusion. The pictures showed a young Asian man, smiling as he posed next to an art installation somewhere downtown. The next picture was of my dad smiling next to the same art piece. I didn't recognize the guy, but I did think it was odd that he looked way younger than my dad. The happy vibe continued for a few other photos. There were pictures of them drinking together at some bar, pictures of the Asian guy looking like he was dancing. He was all smiles in all of the pictures, and suddenly, the vibe of the photos changed dramatically. In the next picture I saw, he was standing awkwardly with his arms by his sides with a look of slight fear on his face. The next few showed him tied to the bed. He was looking up at the camera and the terror on his face was even more pronounced. The final picture showed a man in that cloth mask leaning over the guy. I couldn't see what they were doing, but the guy's legs were all tensed up and pulling on the ropes that bound them, almost like he was in an intense amount of pain. I remember having an incredible visceral reaction to that last picture. So after shoving the photos back into the wallet, I tried to put everything back into the little hidey hole exactly as I'd found it. After that, I abandoned the search for my Game Boy, locked up my dad's office, then spent the rest of the afternoon in my bedroom, swinging back and forth between thinking about what I'd seen and trying to forget about it altogether. When my dad got home from work, he just figured that I was still angry at him for confiscating my Game Boy. Only my mom realized that there was something deeper going on, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her what I'd seen. If I did, it would be the end of my family as I knew it. So, I just kept my mouth shut. It wasn't that I didn't want to talk to someone about the pictures. I just didn't know how to do it without some kind of familial apocalypse. Besides, I wasn't even 100% sure what I'd actually been looking at. I tried to pretend that I hadn't seen anything, but my relationship with my dad was never the same afterwards. All I could do when I saw his face was picturing him in those photos, wondering what the hell he was doing to that poor, unsuspecting guy. I assumed Mom knew nothing about what my dad had been doing in those photographs, and I felt incredibly sorry for her. But at the same time, I was burdened with the horrific guilt of being the only one who could warn her, but not being capable of it. But then the day came when he walked into my bedroom and asked me the one question I've been dreading for almost a year. When he asked if I'd been in his office recently, the words sent a chill through me. Thankfully, I'd learned to hide my emotions very well, so without looking up from playing Sega, I just flatly told him no. After that, I hoped to God that he wouldn't question me further, and I prayed to hear the sound of the door closing behind him. But the seconds went by and the door didn't close. He just stood there, staring at the back of my head, saying nothing, doing nothing. When he asked me if I was sure, I just kept my eyes locked on the screen, then gave him the most nonchalant denial I could muster. Those were some of the scariest few moments of my whole life, and even when the door finally closed, I was terrified that he'd be standing there, waiting to have a private talk with me. He wasn't, which was obviously a huge relief, but as I got back to my game, I started to wonder if he'd actually taken me at my word. Then, like a bullet between the eyes, it hit me. Some minor detail from almost 2 years ago came rushing back into focus. After the dread got too much for me, I'd just shoved the photos back into the wallet. What I hadn't done was rearrange them back into their original order. Someone who really knew those photographs, someone who'd pored over them time and time again, who knew exactly which order they were in. This was obviously a huge problem for me, but as I continued to think on it, I realized something. He couldn't actually accuse me of looking at the pictures. He couldn't just outright accuse anyone because if they weren't the guilty party, they'd know that he'd been hiding something. That little detail was the only thing that saved me from God knows what for years. And with time, the whole thing kind of faded into the background. It was always still there, but the idea of my mom finding out about the pictures, of seeing all the heartbreak and the shame in her, I just couldn't let that happen. Don't get me wrong. I was in almost constant terror of my dad hurting us, but with each day that passed, it grew easier to reassure myself that he wouldn't. The next time the photos seriously weighed on my mind, I was in my second year of college. I was on the opposite side of the country, studying at USC, as far as my grades could take me, though. But moving away came with a fresh helping of guilt. I felt like I abandoned my mom and sister to whoever my dad truly was, or at least used to be. I just couldn't do it anymore. I'd spent 6 years swinging back and forth between anxiety and depression, and it's been years since he'd found out someone had found his little hidey hole, as I call it. If he was going to murder us all in our sleep, I figured that he'd already done it. But then, without all that stress in my life, my mind started to compulsively focus on finer details. I ended up spending hours at a time poring through news articles that detailed missing persons or dead bodies that had been found from all over the Northwest. I didn't know what my dad had actually been doing to that guy. And sometimes, I wish that I'd looked at the rest of the photos so I actually knew for certain. But I knew the guy's face, and I knew I'd be able to recognize him if his pictures were included in some missing persons or murder news piece. On multiple occasions, I considered how utterly futile it was, spending hours at a time reading through random articles that listed the victim as having an Asian-sounding second name. There must have been hundreds from the past decade or so, and when I realized that I didn't actually know when the incident in the photo had taken place, I realized that I was trying to find a needle in a haystack. But then one day, on some rainy Thursday afternoon, I found my needle. I don't want to tell you the poor guy's name because I don't want any of you reaching out to his family. They've definitely already been through enough. But like I said, I found him. I recognized the guy's face from a webpage, and it was a smile. I swear I'd have recognized it anywhere, burned into my brain after having stared at those secret photos. The article gave a few details regarding his last known whereabouts, but mentioned that the guy had talked about visiting a friend in the weeks before his disappearance. They went on to plead for any information, basically saying that the police had no idea what had happened to the poor guy. But I knew. I'd known for years. I just didn't quite realize it. Incidentally, the answer to my fixation brought up a whole new question. Just what was I going to do with this information? The answer was simple. Nothing. There was nothing I could do that wouldn't have a devastating effect on my mom and sister. My sister was still pretty young back then, definitely not the age to process the fact that her father was, at the very minimum, involved in the disappearance of another human being. There was nothing I could do right then, nothing I was okay with, but now that I had my answer, I could at least plan to do something in the future. I didn't quite know when that might be, and I wasn't quite sure how I'd go about it, but I knew I was going to confront him about it, at least before he died. Yet as it turned out, it wasn't my dad's impending death that prompted me to put my plan into action. It was my mom's. 2 years after I graduated college, I was living and working in Charlotte, North Carolina when I got a phone call from my little sister. Mom had cancer, terminal cancer, and it was aggressive. She had a few months tops, and that's what the doctor said anyway, and I planned on spending as much time as possible with her during that time. When she finally passed, and the truth of what my dad had done could no longer hurt her, I made my move, and did something I should have done more than 10 years prior. I called my dad, for the first time in what felt like forever, and I gave him an ultimatum. I told him that I knew what he'd done, that it was me that had found the pictures all those years ago. I told him the only thing that stopped me from saying anything was not wanting to destroy our family, and that I wanted Mom to live a life of blissful ignorance before I finally tore apart his legacy. I gave him 2 choices. He could turn himself into the police and do the right thing, or I'd tell them everything I'd seen, and how I could link it to the missing persons case from the late 90s that I'd found. And the next day, I got another call from my sister, marking the second time she'd been the bearer of bad news in less than 6 months. My dad had taken his own life. It came as a shock. I considered the possibility that I might take his own life before I'd put my plan into action, but decided that he just wasn't the type. I figured he'd go on the run, try to move up to Alaska and change his name or something, maybe even leave the country. I guess it showed how little I really knew him, even up until the day he died. The only thing was, the whole thing didn't die with my dad. There was still more work to be done. I went back home to check his office for the pictures, intent on handing them into the police, but they were gone. I turned the house upside down, even checked the trash for ashes or things of that nature, but I found nothing. He must have destroyed them or disposed them somewhere, but that wasn't good enough. He must have known that sooner or later the cops would get him for whatever he'd been a part of. So he just decided to end it all and rob his victim's family of the justice they deserve. I went to the cops anyway, told them everything I knew, and eventually received a call back from 2 homicide detectives. They called a handful of times over the course of the next few weeks, a few questions here, a few questions there, but then through answering them, I realized how difficult a task they were faced with after DNA swabs of his office yielded no matches for their victim. There was very little they could really prove, and even if I did manage to turn over the photographs, the only person they showed committing a crime is a man in a mask. All they could do was speculate. Yet, I know it was my dad under there. In my mind, there's no reason why he'd take his own life. He'd cultivated such a wholesome facade over the years, having successfully concealed a past blackened by sadism and death, that no one thought him capable of such things, and he was far too proud to watch it all crumble in front of him. But even now, it's still not over. My dad's since been considered as a suspect in the disappearances of multiple young men throughout the 90s and early 2000s. I've still yet to hear anything from the police or FBI regarding it, but it's still something that's being actively considered. So now, all these years later, I'm faced with the possibility that my father was an actual serial killer, and that my silence following the discovery of the photographs enabled him to continue killing. I could be responsible for an untold number of unsolved murders all over the Northwest, and when I tell people that, it's not enough to hear platitudes anymore. So judge me. Pour your scorn upon me, I promise you I can take it. Because as far as I'm concerned, I deserve far, far worse. Click the join button to become a member today for exclusive content. On the evening of December 8th, 1977, 25-year-old Nancy Fox pulled into her driveway after a long day of working at a local jewelry store. She'd lived alone in a modest duplex in Wichita, Kansas, but maintained regular contact with her friends and relatives by phone. After walking through her front door, Nancy put down her things, then attempted to call a friend that she planned to have dinner with that evening. Yet when she picked up the clunky plastic handset and put the receiver to her ear, there was nothing. Nancy then pressed a finger to the phone's switch arms, hoping that a simple line reset would remedy the problem. But still there was silence. It was a silence that was only broken by the sound of a man's voice coming from the room behind her. "Hello, Nancy." When Nancy turned, her heart was pounding from the sudden fright, and she didn't recognize the face that greeted her. But she did recognize that the stranger held a pistol in his hand, a pistol that was pointed at her. The man told her not to bother trying to call anyone, as he'd personally cut the phone line before breaking into her home. Then, when Nancy asked who the man was, he promised to tell her if she helped him with something. With his pistol still trained on her, the man explained to Nancy that he had a certain medical condition, one alleviated by some very unorthodox methods. The man went on to assure Nancy that if she cooperated, she wouldn't be hurt, and then he ordered her into a bathroom and told her to take off her clothes. After doing so, Nancy was tied up and forced to watch her captor disrobe in turn. And then, in a horrifying exhibition of bloodthirsty deception, the man kneeled down beside her and began to strangle her. As the man choked the life out of Nancy, he told her that she wasn't the first vulnerable young woman he'd killed, adding that he'd slaughtered an entire family before she finally caught his eye. Nancy bucked and writhed in the man's grip, but he only squeezed harder, telling her to stop fighting and accept her fate. Minutes later, Nancy Fox was dead. The following morning, the local police department received a call from a nearby payphone. After picking up the phone and greeting the caller, an officer heard a man's voice saying, "You will find a homicide at 843 South Pershing, Nancy Fox." Then, when the officer tried to gather more information, the caller swiftly hung up. Uniformed officers rushed to Nancy's address, finding her nude and lifeless on her bedroom floor. Then, after informing her family of the heartbreaking news, the police issued a public statement regarding her murder. Among the torrent of tips and information that came flooding in from the general public, the police came across a handwritten letter from a man claiming to be Nancy's murderer. He titled the letter, "Oh Death to Nancy," and described how he was driven to kill by what he called Factor X, the same preternatural compulsion to kill which fueled the likes of Jack the Ripper or Son of Sam. The man finished the letter by confessing to the murders of Catherine Bright, Shirley Vian Relford, and 3 members of the Otero family before signing off with 3 little letters that would come to haunt police departments both local and national. BTK. BTK stood for Bind, Torture, Kill, suggesting the killer's method of inflicting terror was his absolute identity. Yet despite his ravenous urge to kill, BTK managed to keep his bloodlust under wraps following the flurry of media attention that his letter received. For 8 long years he remained silent, but on May 5th of 1985, the discovery of a woman's body near Wichita's North Greenwich Road signaled BTK's grim return. 53-year-old Maureen Hedge had been murdered at home before being tied up, terrorized, and dispatched. But before disposing of her body, her killer transported it to a nearby Lutheran church, where he photographed Maureen's lifeless corpse after posing it in a number of suggestive positions. It was quite obvious the work of BTK, yet the authorities were no closer to identifying him as they were 8 years prior when he committed his first murder. Following the murders of the Wichita-based Fogger family, the police were forced to turn to the public in the search for information, and once again, BTK responded by taunting them with a handwritten letter. Although the murders were his handiwork, BTK commended the killer, stating they had performed admirable work. He also mocked investigators for their apparent inability to catch him and assured them that their continued ineptitude would result in a cold case. For a while, BTK was right. In as late 2004, law enforcement believed that there was very little chance he'd be brought to justice. Yet BTK had reveled in the media attention he'd received, and the idea that his work was on the verge of being forgotten about was unbearable to him. To rekindle some of his infamy, BTK wrote a letter to the Wichita Eagle under the name Bill Thomas Kilman. In it, BTK claimed to have murdered Vicki Wegerle on September 16th of 1986, and enclosed photographs of the crime scene, as well as a photograph of her stolen driver's license. This essentially confirmed what the police already suspected, since Vicki's murder bore all of BTK's hallmarks, but a lot had changed since 1986. After extracting the DNA from a skin sample taken from underneath Vicki's fingernails, law enforcement took their first real step towards unmasking one of the most brutal serial killers in American history. 2004 also saw Wichita television station KAKE receive a letter with chapter headings for the BTK story, along with a word puzzle which BTK seemed to have personally created. A few weeks later, a package was found taped to a Wichita stop sign. Then, after making its way into the hands of police officers, they discovered it contained graphic and detailed descriptions of the Otero murders, along with a sketch which was titled, "The Thrill is My Bill." BTK also claimed that he was writing an autobiography called The BTK Story and teased that Chapter 1 would be entitled A Serial Killer is Born. Another package was later found in Wichita's Murdoch Park, containing Nancy Fox's driver's license. An attached letter consisted of the same unhinged ramblings as the last, but the package's contents were markedly different from those that had been discovered previously. In addition to the driver's license and letter, the package was found to contain a Barbie doll. Its hands and feet had been bound with chicken wire, and a small, thick sheet of plastic bags had been placed over its head. It was evidently a recreation of how Nancy Fox had spent her final few hours on this earth, and the media's reporting of the package brought a great deal of distress to her friends and loved ones. At one point, BTK contacted the police with a rather unusual question. He wanted to know if floppy disks could be traced to a particular computer, as due to his increasing fear of DNA identification, he intended to start using them. The police answered his question in a newspaper and posted in the Wichita Eagle and assured BTK that the disks were untraceable. Obviously, that was an outright lie, and on February 16th of 2005, when BTK sent a purple 1.4 megabyte floppy disk to a local TV station, the police immediately analyzed the metadata it contained. One piece of data was pulled from a Microsoft Word document that BTK must have thought he deleted, and appeared to contain the words, Christ Lutheran Church. Police also noted that it was last modified by a user who called themselves Dennis. A quick Google search revealed that the president of the Christ Lutheran Church Council was named Dennis Rader, a man who drove the exact same vehicle as BTK was believed to possess, a black Jeep Cherokee. The overwhelming suspicion led police to test a pap smear taken from Rader's daughter at the Kansas State University Medical Clinic. When compared to the DNA taken from underneath Vicky Wergerly's fingernails, the test showed a familial match. It was all the evidence police needed to place Dennis Rader under arrest, and he was later apprehended while driving near his home in Park City shortly after noon on February 25, 2005. According to the arrest report, a police officer asked Rader, "Do you know why you're going downtown?" with his reply being, "Oh, I have suspicions why." Once Rader was in custody and a sizable amount of evidence had been stacked against him, detectives were so certain that Rader was guilty that they excitedly announced simply, "BTK has been arrested." Rader was then formally charged with 10 counts of first-degree murder in February of 2005, and his bail was set at a jaw-dropping $10 million. At his arraignment, Rader refused to address the courtroom, and a judge was forced to lodge a plea of not guilty on his behalf. However, at the scheduled trial date on June 17th, Rader changed his plea to guilty and confessed to each of his murders in detail. He offered no apologies for his actions, and witnesses later stated that he was incredibly cold in his recollections. At his sentencing, Rader was handed 10 consecutive life sentences by a judge that described him as pure evil, and he was later housed in Kansas's El Dorado Correctional Facility. Rader is now kept in solitary confinement for his own safety. He is permitted only 1 hour of daily exercise and just 3 showers per week, as he is so loathed by the rest of the prison population that officials cannot guarantee his safety outside of these constraints. These procedures are more than likely to remain until the day he dies, as just like Rader intended, the name BTK continues to live in infamy and has become a byword for the brutal torture and murder of innocent young women. I think the scariest thing that ever happened to me was when I was about 15 and my mom and dad had left me home alone while they were into some work dinner related to my dad's job. I was just chilling, watching some TV when I heard a knock at the door. I got up, opened the door, and this total stranger basically falls onto our porch face down. I leapt back as he fell, thinking the bloke must have been drunk or something, but As I started shouting at him to go away before I called the police, he just started saying, "Please, please help me." I took another step back as he turned his face up, and I saw this huge slash running through his nose and lips, splitting both of them in two. I don't know why it happened, but he'd been attacked in the street by someone with a knife, someone who'd both slashed his face and stabbed him in the stomach. Within an hour or so, the fella had been taken away in an ambulance, and my parents were back home, comforting me as the police extracted as much information as possible from me. I couldn't tell them much at all, and they left shortly afterward, but that wasn't the end of it for me. I saw that bloke's face in my nightmares most nights, for months on end. In my dreams, he had two full noses, each with their own twin nostrils that dripped blood down to two different mouths. I ended up painting the face from my nightmares a few years later, and although the painting itself didn't survive the years that had passed, I still have a photograph of it that I might upload to Reddit sometime. Let me know if you guys are interested in seeing it, but I'll have to mark it not safe for work because it definitely isn't something for the faint of heart. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you get a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, you can always pop your headaches with your mind.